What is up, my friend? Welcome back to the basement. I am Mikey Henninger. This is Basement Brewed Fantasy Football, my mom and your mom's favorite fantasy football podcast. This is episode 23 of the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football podcast, and today we are going to cover the Week 11 hit list and shit list, which is exactly what it sounds like. I'm going to go through every game on the 14-game Week 11 slate, and I'm going to talk about one or maybe more players from every single game that are either on my hit list or on my shit list this week. And I'm going to do my best to keep it more to those fringe type of players that you may or may not be considering for your lineup, as opposed to telling you, go out there and start Saquon Barkley, use Justin Jefferson, right? I'm going to try my best to avoid some of those obvious names, but fair warning, sometimes my excitement might get the best of me, and we might need to talk about some of those guys, just like how it's CeeDee Lamb week this week. But before I dive into this week's slate of games, I just cracked open a Cream City Bricks, which I've talked about on the show before. It's my favorite beer on the planet currently. It's from Enlightened Brewery here in Milwaukee. I cracked it open partially because that's part of the shtick of the show, is me drinking a beer while live. But the other part is that I'm a Packer fan, and I am recording this at 11 p.m. on Thursday night, meaning I just finished watching the Packers lose again to the Titans. And these Cream City Bricks are quite the therapy this season for anybody who's a Packer fan. So before I hop into the games, of course, always got to take a quick sip to wet the palate and kind of kick things off. I did my best to not sip my beer, as feedback from my buddy Matt Coakley. Shout out to Matt Coakley telling me how gross it is listening to me slurp my beer on the microphone. So part of me wanted to emphasize it, but I digress. All right, let's dive in. So again, if you've listened to the show last week, or if you watched the show on YouTube, then you're already familiar with what I'm about to say. But if you're new to this show, know that if you're listening to this on podcast, it might make sense to press pause and flip over to YouTube if you have the opportunity. The reason is, as I go through these players, I am also showing off my heat map, which is a resource that I create that 250 plus people use when they're setting their lineups every week. They use it when they're making really tough start-sit decisions, when they're building their DFS lineups, when they're looking for player prop bets. And I'm sharing that. I'm sharing my screen and showing it while I talk through some of these things. So if you're not in the car, or if you have an opportunity to press pause on the podcast itself and flip over to YouTube, it'll be easier and better for you to see what we're talking about as we go through here. All right, first on my list is the Bears at Falcons, which has a 49.5 point over-under, which is the second highest on the 14-game slate. The Bears are underdogs by 3. I was surprised to find the Falcons as 3-point favorites. This isn't a betting show, and I'm not a betting expert, so please don't take this advice any seriously at all. But I personally will likely be tossing $1 or $2 on the Chicago Bears to cover. I like them to win this game outright. But this game should be a high-scoring affair. There should be a lot of points, and frankly, this is a game to target in fantasy football. I plan to make several DFS lineups that feature, frankly, mostly Chicago Bears. Justin Fields plus Darnell Mooney plus Cole Kmet, and then running it back with somebody like Drake London or Kyle Pitts. The player that I want to highlight here that's on my hit list this week is Darnell Mooney. So Darnell Mooney, he, over his last 8 games, he is averaging 10.8 PPR points, 6.4 targets, 4.3 catches, 57.5 yards, but he has just 1 touchdown. Now, because he has just 1 touchdown, despite 466 yards on the season, Darnell Mooney is on my touchdown regression cheat sheet, as he should have 2.8 or so. He should be closer to 2.8 touchdowns. So the Touchdown Regression Cheat Sheet is something that I put together for my subscribers every week that shows them mathematically who is the most likely versus the least likely to score a touchdown in this upcoming week, or at least sooner rather than later. This week last week this list produced 10 touchdowns, by the way. This week we have 18 different names on the list, one of which is Darnell Mooney. Again, he has 466 yards but 1 touchdown. Other similar players with a similar yardage total are averaging around 2.8 touchdowns. So Darnell Mooney's a little bit behind where he quote-unquote should be. I like his chances of hitting on that regression, especially this week. The Falcons are one of the very worst. Actually, no, they are. They are the very worst in football when it comes to defending wide receivers. They are currently hemorrhaging the most PPR points per game, the most catches, the most yards, and the fourth most touchdowns. They are allowing 1.2 touchdowns to wide receivers every single game, so at least one per game. There have been 12 wide receivers in 10 games against Atlanta that have been able to reach 15 or more points against the Falcons. 7 of them were able to get to 22, and 5 of them were able to get to 27, 2 of which broke into the 30s. I like this spot as a high upside spot for Darnell Mooney to find the paint and find the end zone and break that touchdown regression here. He is on my hit list for this week. The second game that I have on my list is the Cleveland Browns at the Buffalo Bills. Now, this game has a 48.5 point over-under, which is the third highest on the 14-game slate. However, it is heavily tilted in Buffalo's favor. The Bills are expected to win by 8.5 points. They are expected to score 28.5 points to Cleveland's 20. Now, I'm not going to spend time on it for the purposes of today's episode, but if I had to put Nick Chubb, by the way, in my hit list or shit list, I would actually have Nick Chubb in my shit list this week because the Browns are 8.5 point underdogs, meaning theoretically at some point and probably sooner than they would like, the Browns are going to have to theoretically abandon their patented run game and that high-powered rushing attack that they usually feature and throw the ball more than they would like to try and keep pace or catch up to the high-powered Buffalo Bills. That could all come at an expense for Nick Chubb, who's averaging under 3 targets per game as a pass catcher. Now, I told you I wouldn't spend time on Nick Chubb, and then I did spend time on Nick Chubb. But again, and one thing I just want to say here real quick is obviously we're not benching Nick Chubb. This is in no way saying go bench Nick Chubb. You can't. And that's why I don't want to spend time on it, because I don't want to convince you to take him out of your lineup. That'd be a bad idea. Just be sure to temper expectations a bit and realize that it's unlikely that he's going to put together one of those 30-point weeks. The name that I did want to highlight here, however, is Donovan Peoples-Jones. He is on my hit list for the week, and this one's a little bit risky considering, going up against Buffalo, things could fall off the rails pretty easily for Cleveland. But interestingly, over the last 6 games, Donovan Peoples-Jones is pacing almost almost dead even with Amari Cooper. He's averaging 12.1 PPR points per game, 6.7 targets, 4.7 catches, 74 yards, but again, he has no touchdowns. And with 518 yards on the season, but somehow no touchdowns to show for it, Donovan Peoples-Jones comes in 4th on my list of positive touchdown regression candidates. He should have scored closer to 2.8 touchdowns by now, and he has 0. So he is in 4th on that touchdown regression cheat sheet that I'm putting together for my 250 plus subscribers. Now, he is, and the other quick note on DPJ, he's been very consistent here as of late. He's actually scored 11 or more PPR points in 5 of the last 6 games. Now, none have been able to reach 15 points, but that makes sense considering the guy's not finding the end zone. And again, he has a really good chance of changing that here this week. Now, the matchup itself is slightly tougher than average. It's not brutal. It's not good, but it's slightly tougher than average. He does have that, touchdown regression working in his favor, and that there's some upside there to consider. But the Bills are, they are actually allowing the 13th most catches per game to wide receivers and the 10th most yards per game to wide receivers. So there's some positives to look forward to for Donovan Peoples-Jones. Now, on the more pessimistic side, the Bills are holding wide receivers to the 12th fewest touchdowns at 0.8 per game. At the micro level, so looking at individual wide receivers as opposed to just the statistics, there have been just 6 wide receivers in 9 games that have been able to reach 15 PPR points against the Bills. In fact, just 11 of them in 9 games have been able to reach even just 10 points. Now, on the more optimistic side of all that, the Bills have allowed 2 different 31-plus point eruptions, including Justin Jefferson's 35.3 last week, which is the season high against Buffalo. Obviously, Donovan Peoples-Jones is not Justin Jefferson, and Justin Jefferson makes his own rules and plays by his own rules. But the Browns, like I mentioned before, as 8.5-point underdogs, seem likely to have to eventually abandon their run-heavy approach and embrace a heavier passing volume in order to keep up or at least catch up to the Buffalo Bills. Meaning, if Donovan Peoples-Jones keeps doing what he's been doing here as of late, he should be peppered with targets the same way Amari Cooper is, and he has mathematical touchdown regression working in his favor in a slightly worse than average matchup. Again, it's not exciting and it's a risky call, but I promise to give you a fringe player that's either on my hit list or on my shit list, and if I have to have Donovan Peoples-Jones in my lineups this week, there's certainly much worse wide receiver 3-4 options that I could be putting out there. Again, don't break your neck trying to get Donovan Peoples-Jones into your lineup, but if you're looking for someone with some sneaky upside this week, look no further than DPJ. Game number 4, Carolina Panthers, Baltimore Ravens. This game has just a 41.5 point over under. The game is very heavily favored very heavily tilted in Baltimore's favor. The Ravens are 13-point favorites over the Carolina Panthers. Carolina is expected to score just 14 points, which is easily the lowest on the Week 11 slate. On my shit list is D'Onta Foreman, which might feel hard to bench after last week's eruption. In fact, I had him on my bench last week, and that did not work out. D'Onta Foreman, he's been playing very well. He's averaging 17.4 PPR points per game, 20.8 touches, 1.8 targets, 1 catch, 104 yards, and he has 4 touchdowns. Now, D'Onta Foreman, he has 16 or more PPR points in 3 of the last 4 games. So why in the world would I have him on my shit list? Well, there's very real reason for pause and concern this week. The main reason is the fact that the Panthers are 13-point underdogs. Again, like the Browns-Bills game, this theoretically implies a supremely negative game script that is going to force the Carolina Panthers to have to throw the ball a heck of a lot more than they would like to, just like they did in Week 9 when they got blown out 42-21 by the Cincinnati Bengals, where D'Onta Foreman was only able to receive 9 touches as the Panthers were chasing the Bengals all afternoon. And this Sunday, it seems very likely that Carolina has to chase Baltimore all over the field, meaning D'Onta Foreman is likely to be the one who suffers, and his volume should take, quote-unquote should take a hit as the Panthers have to abandon that rushing attack. I think he's a very, very risky play. He's a trap here in Week 11. Now, the matchup itself, that's not anything to like either. It's not anything that's daunting or terrible, but the Ravens are on the pessimistic side of average. They are allowing the 6th most catches at 6 per game and the 5th most receiving yards, but that's not really a part of D'Onta Foreman's game. Strictly on the ground, the Ravens are holding running backs to the 15th fewest PPR points, the 3rd fewest touches, the 4th fewest rushing yards, 11th fewest scrimmage yards, and the 8th fewest touchdowns, and just 4 running backs in 9 games have been able to reach 15 PPR points against the Ravens. D'Onta Foreman is somebody who is on the wrong side of the fence if I'm considering him in my fantasy football lineups this week. All right, next game on my list is the Lions and the Giants. This sip is for you, Coakley. All right. Lions-Giants. This game, by the way, I promised I wouldn't spend time on the obvious players, but Saquon is in a great spot here as 3-point favorites against a weak Detroit Lions rush defense. But instead, I'm going to focus on Daniel Jones, who is one of my favorite streamer options at the quarterback position this week. Now, the Giants are expected to score about 24 points, which is the 8th most on the 28-team slate. They're expected to walk away with a 3-point home win over the Detroit Lions, who are a Swiss cheese defense pretty much everywhere on the field, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. And the Giants, just in general, are a team to target in your Week 11 fantasy football lineups, which is something that I never thought anybody would ever say. The Giants is somebody you want to target, but here we are. After 9 games, Daniel Jones is averaging a very, very respectable 16.5 fantasy points per game, 177 passing yards, 43 rushing yards, and he has 8 passing touchdowns and just 2 interceptions, also adding 3 rushing touchdowns with his legs. He's a quarterback 2, per usual, but he has some very significant streamer upside in week 11. He has quarterback, top 12 upside in week 11 in a best possible matchup against a Detroit Lions defense that's the worst in the league when it comes to defending quarterbacks. Detroit is allowing the most fantasy points at 22.8 per game, the 7th most passing yards, the 6th most passing touchdowns, and 6 quarterbacks in 9 games have been able to reach 18 or more fantasy points against Detroit. 5 of those 6 have been able to score 24 or more, and 2 of them have been able to score 31 or more, including Justin Fields' 39.4 fantasy points against Detroit just last week, which is the current record against Detroit. Now, again, Justin Fields, he's in another field of his own. Daniel Jones isn't quite Justin Fields, but everybody who's playing against Detroit is beating them up in pretty high-powered fashion here. So Daniel Jones, he's on the hit list. He is one of my favorite quarterback streaming options of the week. All right, the next game is arguably the ugliest on the entire Week 14 slate. We have the Jets and the Patriots, which has a 38-point over-under, which is the lowest on the slate. The game features 2 terrible offenses and 2 above-average defenses, meaning this is a game to avoid everywhere you can in fantasy football. But I promise to give you at least one player in every game. So one player on my shit list that I would recommend avoiding here this week is James Robinson, who actually has been a topic of discussion in our subscribers-only Discord channel, which is something that my subscribers have access to. It's where several of us, are dedicated and energetic and passionate about helping each other win. We're frequently seeking feedback from each other on, should I do this trade? Should I, who should I claim off waivers? Who should I start? Who should I sit, etc. And James Robinson has been a topic of that conversation. Now, this week, the Jets are expected to score less than 18 points. They have the 4th lowest implied total on the 28-team slate, and they're expected to lose in a 3-point road loss to the division rival New England Patriots. The game has a teeny tiny over-under, like we talked about. 38 points is the lowest on the slate. And there are tough defenses on both sides of the ball, so this is a game to basically avoid anywhere you can in fantasy football. Now, James Robinson did jump up to 40% of the snaps in Week 9 before the Jets bye week, and he was able to he received 15 touches, including 2 catches and targets for 53 yards and 1 touchdown. So he totaled 13.3 PPR points, which doesn't blow anything up, but it is useful in fantasy football. Now, he does very much figure to remain in a near dead-even timeshare with Michael Carter, but he's best treated as a downside RB3 this week in a brutal, absolutely worst possible environment and worst possible Week 11 matchup with a league-best Patriots defense when it comes to defending the running back. The Pats are somehow allowing the 12th most receiving yards to running backs, which is a potential benefit to Michael Carter. But other than that, they are suffocating running backs to the tune of the fewest PPR points per game, the 8th fewest catches, the 8th fewest touches, the 8th fewest catches, the 9th fewest rushing yards, the 9th fewest scrimmage yards, and the fewest touchdowns. They are allowing 0.2 running back touchdowns per game. Just one running back in 9 games against the Patriots has been able to score 15 PPR points against them. Nobody has been able to reach 16. So James Robinson is on my shit list. He's somebody to avoid at all costs in Week 11 if possible. The next game on my list is another ugly game and one that's really tough to get excited about in fantasy football, but it's the Rams at Saints, which has a 39-point over-under, the 2nd lowest on the Week 11 slate. There's 2 names that I kind of wanted to flip a coin here when it comes to considering in your Week 11 lineup. They're both on the quote-unquote hit list. The first one is Chris Olave, and I'm not sure he's really a fringe player anymore. There's a lot of fantasy football managers out there who need to have Chris Olave in their lineups regardless of situation or matchup. But if he is somebody who's kind of on that wide receiver 3 line for you and you're not sure if you want him in your lineup, this is a good spot to use him. Now, the scary part of the matchup is that he could be dancing with Jalen Ramsey all afternoon, and that's a daunting task for a rookie. But the data and the numbers say that this could be a good spot for Chris Olave. So in 6 games with Andy Dalton, Olave is averaging 13.3 PPR points, 8 targets, 4.8 catches, 65 yards, but he has just 2 touchdowns. Now, with 658 yards but just 2 touchdowns this year, Chris Olave is 9th on my touchdown regression cheat sheet. He should have, quote-unquote, closer to 3.9 touchdowns by now. He is a regression boosted. He's a high-end wide receiver 3, and again, he has a good-looking matchup despite part of it being with Jalen Ramsey. If he's able to avoid Ramsey, the Rams have actually been a friendly foe for wide receivers to this point, allowing the 10th most PPR points, the 3rd most catches, 12th most yards, and the 10th most touchdowns. 9 wide receivers in 9 games against the Rams have been able to reach at least 15 PPR points, including 2 last week alone. 5 of those 9, by the way, have been able to score 20 points or more. Ah, man, that beer is good. All right. The other name that I wanted to, I know I said 1 per list, but Allen Robinson does at least deserve some mention here. And I know it's risky, it's scary, it's gut-wrenching thinking about using Allen Robinson in the year 2022 and the way things have gone there. But Cooper Kupp is on IR, missing at least the next 4 games, and that's going to free up 11.6 targets that theoretically need to be redistributed. Anybody who's watched any Rams game can see that Matthew Stafford goes into where's Cooper Kupp mode anytime the Rams are in distress or he's in distress or a play, starts to fall apart. That is going to be a safety blanket that's no longer there. And Allen Robinson figures to be the next man up, stepping into that wide receiver 1 role. Now, he's not going to suddenly become Cooper Kupp and be this this fantasy football wide receiver 1, but for a guy that I've seen on the waiver wire in more shallow leagues, Allen Robinson is finally going to come into some fantasy football value. And this week, he actually has a solid matchup. He's playing a Saints defense that's allowing the 14th most receiving yards and the 14th most PPR points. Now, they are holding wide receivers to the 14th fewest catches and the 12th fewest touchdowns. So all in all, the Saints are more of a mediocre matchup than a good matchup. But even still, as the new de facto wide receiver 1 for the LA Rams, Allen Robinson finally should come into fantasy football value, and I think he's worth taking a look at if you're considering putting him in your fantasy football lineups this week, although I wouldn't blame you if you have superior options where you can take a week to see how the Rams deploy their wideouts, sans Cooper Kupp, and with Cooper Kupp on IR. All right, the next game on this list is the Eagles at the Colts, and this is actually a pretty fun game for fantasy football purposes. There's a lot of high-powered names. There's a lot of fantasy football studs in this game, and a lot of them are going up against really tough matchups. For example, A.J. Brown has been a stud this year, but he's going up against the best against the best defense when it comes to defending wide receivers in the Indianapolis Colts, and he's been hurt lately. So on my shit list for this game is Devontae Smith. Now, this is a bit of a risky call because this game has some shootout potential, so I could totally see the Colts trying their best to eliminate A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith being the beneficiary of it, but mathematically, Devontae Smith is averaging, after 9 games, he's averaging 12.5 PPR points, 6.8 targets, 5.1 catches, 53.4 yards, and he has 3 touchdowns. He's about as boom or bust as can be as a wide receiver because he has 4 games under 8 PPR points, including 2 in the last 3 games. But he also has 5 games over 15 PPR points, including... and on the topic of boom or bust, Devontae Smith has a game of 0 points on his resume this year, as well as a game of 30.9 points on his resume this year. So he's about as boom or bust as they come. And again, he's going up against a league best Indianapolis Colts. There's no defense that's better at defending wide receivers than the Colts have been this year. They are holding wide receivers to the fewest PPR points per game, the second fewest catches, second fewest yards, fourth fewest touchdowns, and just 4 wide receivers have been able to score 14 or more PPR points against these Colts. Heck, even just 9 wide receivers in 10 games have been able to score even just 10 PPR points against the Colts. 9 wide receivers in 10 games, so less than 1 per game, has been able to score even just 10 PPR points against the Indianapolis Colts. And the other piece of this, by the way, is that the Eagles are 7-point favorites, implying they really shouldn't have to throw the ball all that much to be able to control the Colts, especially when you realize the Colts give up the 11th most PPR points per game to running backs, so they seem a lot more susceptible via the rushing attack on the ground than they are through the air. And there's not a lot of reason for the Eagles to theoretically have to throw the ball too much, especially in an impossible matchup. So Devontae Smith is on the quote-unquote shit list this week. Next up is Brian Robinson and the Commanders. It feels gross. It feels absolutely disgusting thinking about putting Brian Robinson in a lineup this year, but he arguably will not have a better opportunity than he has this week. The Washington Commanders are 3-point favorites over the Houston Texans. For once, the Commanders seem to never be the favorite team. So that implies a positive game script that will allow the Commanders to keep the ball on the ground. Taylor Heineke won't have to throw it all over the place. And Brian Robinson has the best possible matchup that a running back can possibly get against a league worst Houston Texans defense. The Texans are getting absolutely slaughtered each and every week by opposing running backs. They are hemorrhaging the most PPR points, the most touches, most rushing yards, most scrimmage yards, and the second most touchdowns per game. Now, to their credit, the Texans are holding running backs to the 12th fewest catches and the 13th fewest receiving yards, but none of that is a part of Brian Robinson's game anyway. They are getting shredded on the ground by running backs. 7 running backs in 9 games against the Texans have been able to score 15 or more PPR points, including 4 in the last 4 games. But wait, there's more. Of those 7 running backs, 5 of them have been able to score 23 or more PPR points, including 3 in the last 4 games. But wait, there's more. Of those 5, 4 of them have been able to score 30 or more PPR points, including 2 in the last 4 games. Okay, that's it. But you get the idea. The Texans are getting absolutely annihilated by running backs. The Commanders are actually favored, and they figure to feed Brian Robinson and, by the way, Antonio Gibson. He'd be on the hit list too. But both of those guys should get all of the volume they could possibly handle. If there's a week you're going to use Brian Robinson, this is it. All right, next up, we got the Raiders at the Broncos. And on my hit list in this game, I have both Russell Wilson and Melvin Gordon. I wasn't sure if I should cover Russell Wilson because in shallower leagues, he's more of a streamer, whereas I know in deeper leagues, he's already rostered. Unfortunately, he's probably somebody's, locked in QB1. But if he's on your waiver wire and you find yourself in a pinch, Russell Wilson is in a great spot this week. The last time Russell Wilson faced the Las Vegas Raiders, I almost said Oakland there. The last time he faced the Raiders, he put together a whopping 26.38 fantasy points in week 4, which is by far the best game Russell Wilson has had yet this year. So the name that I will focus on is Melvin Gordon, who otherwise is he's an RB3. He's not exciting at all with Latavius Murray and now Chase Edmonds in town, but this is a great spot for Melvin Gordon. There is some potential as a home-favored running back. The Broncos are favored by 3, so theoretically he should get plenty of volume. He's not going to get scripted out of this one. And he has a terrific matchup. The Raiders are getting smacked by running backs. They're allowing the 4th most PPR points, 3rd most touches, 4th most catches, 2nd most receiving yards, 15th most rushing yards, and the 5th most scrimmage yards, plus 10th most touchdowns. So everywhere on the field that a running back can attack the Raiders, they are. 5 running backs in 9 games against the Raiders have been able to score 15 or more PPR points against them, including 4 in the last 4 games, 3 of which have been able to hit 24, including Alvin Kamara's 42.8 point eruption in week 8. So again, kind of like Brian Robinson, if there's a week that you're going to use Melvin Gordon, this would be the one. And I would also include Latavius Murray in that list. If you're trying to decide between the two, I would go with Melvin Gordon as the quote-unquote lead back. But both guys are viable for once in fantasy football this week. On my hit list for the next game, which is Cowboys-Vikings. This game is the one that I'm going to focus on here is Michael Gallup. I really want to focus on CeeDee Lamb because he is the only player in my column A, which is my too good to be true list. I only have one player in that column this week, and that's CeeDee Lamb. He's checking all of the boxes. All signs point to him having yet another eruption day against the Vikings. But this game in general is one to target from a fantasy football standpoint. It has a 47.5 over-under. Both teams have implied totals that are in the top half of the league, so it should be a shootout. Both teams are expected to score a lot of points. Michael Gallup is the name that I am going to focus on here because, again, we want to focus on fringe players in case there's anybody that you're looking for as far as like a rental goes. Michael Gallup would check the box here this week. He hasn't done anything yet this year, which is what makes him risky. In 3 games with Dak Prescott, Gallup is only averaging 5.5 PPR points, 5 targets, 2.7 catches, 28 yards, and he has no touchdowns. He has yet to even hit 9 PPR points in a game with Dak Prescott this season. So, yeah, it's risky for me to sit here and tell you that Michael Gallup is on my hit list. But again, I promised I wouldn't be sitting here feeding you, hey, you should use CeeDee Lamb this week because he's going to go off. You're already using CeeDee Lamb regardless. So if you're in a spot where you're in a pinch and you're looking for some sort of upside at wide receiver, Michael Gallup just might be that guy. The Minnesota Vikings are getting absolutely obliterated, especially lately, by wide receivers. They are allowing the 3rd most PPR points, the 2nd most catches, the 2nd most yards, and the 10th most touchdowns. And even though they're already allowing the 10th most touchdowns, they are actually on my touchdown regression cheat sheet. So one thing I do that's a little bit unique to the fantasy football space is in that touchdown regression cheat sheet that I was telling you about and that I was showing moments ago, I also put not just individual players, but actual team defenses to show you which defenses are mathematically most likely to allow multiple touchdowns to certain positions. And this week, the Minnesota Vikings are on that list for wide receivers. They have allowed 1,794 scrimmage yards to wide receivers, but they've only allowed 8 touchdowns when they should have allowed closer to 10.3 touchdowns on average by now. So even though they're already giving up the 10th most touchdowns per game, they are quote-unquote due for more. 10 wide receivers in 9 games against the Vikings have been able to score 15 or more PPR points against them. 7 of those 10 have been within the last 4 games, including 2 different 21-plus point games last week alone. So to restate that, 7 wide receivers have been able to score 7 wide receivers in the last 4 games have been able to score at least 15 or more PPR points. 5 of those 10, by the way, have been able to score 21 or more PPR points, and all 5 of those games have been in the last 4 games, including a 33.9 eruption from DeAndre Hopkins in Week 8. So the Vikings are just getting absolutely smashed, absolutely shredded by wide receivers lately. This game projects as a shootout where both teams should have to elevate their passing totals and passing volume. And if there's a world in which the Vikings actually jump on the Cowboys early, which the way that they've been playing, it's certainly possible, Dallas is going to have to throw the ball all afternoon, and it can't all go to CeeDee Lamb. Michael Gallup should be involved, and he has a great matchup to finally, bust out of his slump and show some signs of life here in Week 11. All right, the next game is the Bengals and the Steelers. The name that I want to highlight here is T. Higgins because I almost had him in column A. this week, but chances are if you have T. Higgins in your fantasy football lineup, you are already planning on using him. So instead, I'll zero in on Tyler Boyd, who is one of those fringe players. Now, in 2 games without Jamar Chase, Tyler Boyd hasn't had quite the explosive results that I think a lot of us were expecting. He's been fine. He hasn't been bad, but he hasn't done anything crazy exciting. He's totaled 22.2 PPR points, 11 targets, 8 catches, 82 yards, and 1 touchdown. He's a wide receiver 3 this week, but he does have some upside in an absolutely mouth-watering matchup against a Steelers defense that's getting spanked by wide receivers. They are allowing the 2nd most PPR points, the 8th most catches, 3rd most yards, and the most touchdowns at 1.4 per game. 10 wide receivers in 9 games have been able to score 15 or more PPR points against the Steelers. 6 of those 10 were able to hit 23 or more PPR points. And 2 of those 6 were able to hit 32 or more PPR points, including A.J. Brown's season high, 39.6 against Pittsburgh just 2 weeks ago. So Tyler Boyd, if you have an opportunity to get him in your lineup and you're on the fence, this is a good week as opposed to a bad week. He is on the quote-unquote hit list. 2 games to go. We got the next game up is the Chiefs and the Chargers, and the name that I want to focus in on here is Isaiah Pacheco. Isaiah Pacheco is starting to run away with the lead running back job in Kansas City. Last week he played a season/career high 56% of the Chiefs' offensive snaps. He received 16 touches. Unfortunately, all of them were carries, but still. He received 16 touches for 82 yards. He did not find the end zone, so he only scored 8.2 PPR points. More importantly, though, Clyde Edwards-Helaire played a total of just 4 snaps last week and did not receive a single touch, which made it seemingly clear that the Chiefs are intent on moving forward with a 2-headed backfield rather than the 3-headed approach they've been using in weeks past. Jerick McKinnon is going to continue to be the pass-catching specialist. He, by the way, has 16 targets over the last 2 games. But Isaiah Pacheco has cemented himself, well, as much as you can cement yourself in fantasy football, but he's cemented himself as the lead running back in Kansas City. And this week, the Chiefs are 6-point favorites, which is going to imply strong volume for the rushing attack as they eventually look to kill the clock later in the game. And the Chiefs are expected to score 28.5 points, which is the most on the Week 11 slate, which is going to imply some scoring opportunities theoretically for Isaiah Pacheco and for the Chiefs in general. And if none of that was enough, the Chargers are one of the friendliest, one of the best matchups to attack with their running backs in fantasy football. Technically, they've held running backs to the 14th fewest receiving yards, but that's not really a part of Isaiah Pacheco's game, at least to this point anyway. Other than that, they are getting absolutely hammered by running backs. They are bleeding the 3rd most PPR points, 5th most touches, 13th most catches, 2nd most rushing yards, 2nd most scrimmage yards, and 3rd most touchdowns. 7 running backs in 9 games have been able to score 15 or more PPR points against the Chargers, including 1 in each of the last 3 games. So if there's a week you're going to trust Isaiah Pacheco, all of the data points to this being the week for Pacheco. You just need to hope he actually finds the end zone, because it's clear he's not going to get a lot of work in the passing attack. Jerick McKinnon has that locked down. All right, last but not least, we're going to talk 49ers Cardinals. And I really want to talk to you guys about George Kittle, but again, you probably used your 4th-round draft pick on him, which means you're forced to start him in fantasy football anyway. But if you have Kittle and you're forced to start him this week, feel good about it. This is a George Kittle week. The Cardinals are getting absolutely smashed by tight ends. They have allowed the most PPR points per game to tight ends, and I will leave it at that. If you really want to read more, all of this is over at basementbroodff.com for my subscribers. The name that I will focus on here, and this is a risky call, but it's been a while since I put anybody on the shit list. So on the shit list this week is James Conner. It's a tough week to feel good about James Conner. Now, the reason that this is a risky call is because James Conner seemingly in the last 7 days has become a full-blown workhorse. Last week, Arizona committed to Connor in a very big way. They force-fed him 24 touches, which included 3 targets and catches. He had 86 yards and 2 touchdowns, which was 23.6 PPR points. But after that game, the Cardinals mysteriously released Eno Benjamin just a few days later. We still don't really know why. It was a very strange move, very strange turn of events. But suddenly James Conner is locked and loaded at the very top of the Cardinals depth chart with seemingly zero competition, especially with Darrell Williams still on injured reserve. Now, Conner does appear locked into that workhorse volume, but being an 8-point underdog and in a brutal matchup, this is a far from ideal scenario for James Conner. He is going to need to get significant work in the passing game to be fantasy football relevant in Week 11, though, to be fair, we've seen James Conner get work in the passing game. We've seen him get targets, get catches, and get receiving yards. So it's entirely possible this placement of him on the shit list could completely backfire, but still, 8-point underdogs and an absolutely brutal matchup with the San Francisco 49ers, who are lights out against running backs, holding them to the second fewest PPR points per game, 10th fewest touches, the fewest rushing yards, the fewest scrimmage yards, and the 3rd fewest touchdowns. Now, again, back to the optimistic side, they are allowing the 8th most catches and the 15th most receiving yards to running backs. James Conner is going to absolutely it's a necessity. Conner is going to have to take advantage of those receiving loopholes in the 49ers matchup, because if he doesn't, he is likely going to get shut down and disappoint his fantasy football managers in a big week this way. Just 2 running backs in 9 games of the season have been able to score 14 or more PPR points against the San Francisco 49ers. By the way, if you like this kind of analysis, I do this for literally every single player in every single game, every single week. This thing literally takes me 24 plus hours a week. If you're on YouTube, you can see my eyes and how drained I am after working on this all week and then recording the pod. But this thing, every single player in every single game of every single week has this type of written analysis. My subscribers have access to this. All I ask from them is to buy me a beer every single month. And they're not just getting the weekly heat map, by the way. They are getting the touchdown regression cheat sheet that we talked through. They are getting I put together a streamer cheat sheet every single week. By the way, speaking of streamers, one other name that I wanted to put on my hit list is Jimmy Garoppolo. He's in a terrific spot for quarterback streamers this week, so there's a little bonus there for you. But my subscribers are getting the heat map, my regression cheat sheet, my streamer cheat sheet. They are getting access to my personal favorite DFS picks and guys that I'm looking to get into my DFS lineups this week. They have access to our members-only Discord channel, which is that Discord community I told you about, that people where we have several dedicated subscribers that are dedicated to helping each other win. And being a part of that Discord community, by the way, means that you also get live real-time notifications anytime news breaks and injuries happen. You get live recommendations from me, basically telling you, hey, go beat your friends, go beat your competition to the waiver wire because so-and-so just got hurt, which means you should pick up this guy. Anyways, all of this analysis, all of this service, this is all part of the weekly package that my 250 plus subscribers are getting from me every single week in exchange for a beer per month. All I ask is that you buy me 1 beer every month, and I will not hand deliver, I will electronically deliver all of this fantasy football goodness to you every single week. So I don't pay for I don't get advertising dollars for my podcast. Instead, I use the podcast to advertise the subscription. Totally kidding. Not really, because that's basically what I just did. But that's going to do it for today's show. That's going to do it for me on the night. I am very much ready to get to bed. That's a wrap on today's show. I will be back on, Tuesday? I'll be back on Tuesday with episode 24, which will feature players for you to add both before and after Week 12 waivers run. Look for that episode on Tuesday, and look for the article itself on Tuesday morning as well. Until then, please, please, please like, subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you're watching, wherever you're listening to it. And if you'd be so kind, give me a follow over on Twitter at BBFFMikey, and I'll be sure to follow you back if you let me know where you came from. Until Tuesday, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for being here, listening, watching. You're helping a kid chase his dreams and make those dreams come true. I can't thank you enough for that. Cheers. This brew that I'm just about ready to chug is for you. Maybe I should do it on camera next time.